The moment 6 police cruisers rolled onto my quiet suburban street with lights flashing and sirens wailing, you would have thought I was running a black market fireworks ring or harboring a fugitive. But no. According to my HOA president Karen, I was operating a biological hazard in the form of a backyard pool. That's right. My fully permitted, professionally installed saltwater pool was the subject of a full-blown 911 emergency. As officers poured through my gate with flashlights and gloved hands, barking questions about chemical storage and toxic runoff, I stood there holding a margarita and a flamingo pool float, wondering if I'd been cast in a reality show prank. That surreal scene kicked off the unraveling of one of the pettiest, most ridiculous, and ultimately most satisfying neighborhood feuds in HOA history. And it all started with one woman, one power trip, and one very, very bad decision. 3 months ago, I moved into Serene Meadows, a name that now feels like satire. The houses were pristine, the lawns competitive, and the atmosphere just fake enough to pass for Stepford. My new place had a decent backyard, and after years of saving, I finally decided to treat myself with a pool. Not just any pool, mind you. This thing was gorgeous. Sleek concrete edges, built-in spa jets, LED lighting that changed colors at night, and a waterfall feature that made me feel like I was living in a resort. I did everything by the book. Got the permits, paid the fees, even had an HOA-approved landscaper submit design renderings for community review. 0 complaints. Or so I thought. Enter Karen. She showed up on my 3rd day of construction, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting a rodent. She didn't introduce herself. She just launched straight into a series of passive-aggressive observations. Pools can bring in bugs, chlorine can damage neighboring gardens, and my personal favorite, not everyone wants to hear splashing all day. I told her politely, at first, that the pool was within regulation. She sniffed, scribbled something on her clipboard, and walked off muttering about people with no respect for neighborhood integrity. By the time the pool was finished, Karen was waging a full-on campaign. It started with HOA violation notices that made no sense, claims about improper fencing, excessive noise, and unauthorized light fixtures. I refuted every single one with documentation, but she just kept escalating. At one point, she accused me of creating an eyesore visible from the street. The pool is behind a 10-foot privacy fence. You'd need a ladder and night vision goggles to see anything. Then came the infamous chlorine incident. One Saturday morning, I woke up to find a note stuck to my door in plastic, like some kind of biohazard warning. It read, "Strong chemical odors detected. HOA investigating environmental compliance." 2 hours later, a man with a clipboard and a nasal voice introduced himself as an environmental consultant hired by Karen. I nearly laughed. When I asked for credentials, he mumbled something about working with community ecological standards, then got into a beat-up minivan with no license plates. I reported the incident, and the HOA formally denied hiring him. Surprise. At that point, I decided to ignore her. I threw a small pool party with a few friends, nothing wild, just music, some drinks, and floating neon noodles. That, apparently, was the last straw. Karen called the non-emergency police line 3 times that night, complaining about unauthorized aquatic events. The officer who showed up apologized profusely, confirmed I was doing nothing wrong, and even accepted a root beer before leaving. I figured that would be the end of it. But Karen wasn't done. 1 week later, while I was relaxing on a pool float with noise-canceling headphones, I didn't hear the ruckus at the front of the house. I didn't hear her screaming into her phone, waving her arms like she was directing air traffic. I didn't hear the sirens until they were practically in my backyard. The police had been told, by Karen, that there was a potential chemical spill, possible code violations, and signs of dangerous activity near open water. That was the actual phrase. Dangerous activity near open water. When the officers entered, I stood up dripping wet, completely baffled, while one of them asked where I kept the barrels. It took 10 awkward, slightly comedic minutes to explain that my only barrels were full of pool toys. I brought out the permits again, showed them the inspection photos, and invited them to check every inch. A few officers took pictures, not of my supposed violations, but of the pool itself. Apparently one of them was considering a remodel. The sergeant pulled me aside and said, "Ma'am, this all checks out. Whoever called this in may have exaggerated, significantly. That might have been the end of it, just another absurd Karen incident to laugh about over cocktails." But then, just as the officers were preparing to leave, one of them noticed something odd. A small drone perched on my back fence. Not mine. Not anything I'd seen before. The officer picked it up, and sure enough, it was still warm. Karen had apparently been flying surveillance drones over my property to collect evidence. That crossed a serious legal line. When asked, she came marching over from her yard like she was on a warpath, yelling, "That's my drone. I have a right to document code violations." The sergeant didn't laugh. He calmly informed her that filming over private property without consent, particularly near areas like pools, could fall under unlawful surveillance. And then, oh, the karma, he asked her to come with him for questioning. Her face turned the color of uncooked chicken. She stammered, accused me of setting her up, then tried to storm off back to her house. But 2 officers gently but firmly stopped her. In front of half the neighborhood, Karen was escorted into the back of a police car. Not arrested, yet, but detained for investigation. What started as a petty power play over a backyard pool had just exploded into something much, much bigger. The entire neighborhood watched as the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA was driven away in silence. And me? I climbed back into the pool, tipped my margarita to the sky, and whispered, "Plot twist." The next morning, the neighborhood group chat was on fire. Everyone was talking in hushed, gossip-laced texts about the great pool raid and how Karen, of all people, had been put into the back of a police cruiser like a low-budget villain in a crime show. Screenshots of drone laws and HLA guidelines were being passed around like candy, and someone even uploaded a grainy video from their Ring camera showing Karen arguing with officers before they walked her to the car. It didn't take long for the situation to boil over from a quiet HOA annoyance into full-on neighborhood theater. People who had once feared Karen's clipboard were now emboldened by her humiliation, and I could feel the energy shifting. But I also knew better than to relax. Karen might have suffered a public embarrassment, but she wasn't the kind of person to slink away quietly. She was the kind of person who would double down. Sure enough, within 3 days, the HLA board issued a new email. It was written in a language that tried to sound professional but reeked of petty vengeance. The subject line read, "Special Community Bylaw Update, Residential Water Features." I knew immediately that this was about me. The document outlined updated aesthetic standards for pools, ponds and fountains, citing concerns over reflected light nuisances, excessive chemical use, and unauthorized gatherings. It was basically a laundry list of things that only applied to my pool, hidden behind vague, overreaching terminology. Worse, they proposed retroactive enforcement. Retroactive. Like I was supposed to unbuild my pool to fit their whims. I wasn't the only one fuming. My next-door neighbor Janet, retired schoolteacher, cookie baker, and closet firecracker, marched over with a printout in hand. "This is nonsense," she said, shaking the paper like it was a cheating exam. "She's targeting you. Everyone knows it." She had a point. The language in the proposed bylaw changes didn't apply to any of the older, smaller pools in the community. Just mine. And Janet's husband pointed out that the fine schedule conveniently aligned with what Karen had shouted about during her first confrontation with me. $200 a day until it's removed. At the emergency HOA meeting, things hit a whole new level of ridiculous. Karen didn't attend, likely still licking her wounds, but she sent a proxy. A man named Jeff, the vice president of the board and, I suspected, her personal lapdog. He stood stiffly behind the podium, reading from a sheet of paper while avoiding eye contact with anyone under the age of 70. He claimed the changes were to preserve property values and maintain uniform visual harmony. A man in the back coughed loudly and muttered, "What the hell is uniform about a koi pond and a 6-foot flamingo statue?" Laughter rippled through the room. When it came time for community input, I stood up with a folder full of documents, permits, approvals, even signed emails from Karen herself authorizing my pool plan months ago. "This isn't about harmony," I said. "This is about Karen not getting her way. And let's be honest, she's not even following her own rules. Her backyard has more illegal structures than a pirate island." That got a few gasps and some clap. Jeff turned red and mumbled something about keeping comments respectful, but the damage was done. The meeting ended with no vote taken. It was clear they hadn't expected pushback. But the real twist came the next day, over coffee with Janet and another neighbor named Luis. We were talking about Karen's obsession with enforcement when Luis casually mentioned something strange. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Karen told me last year that her pool didn't need a permit because it was part of her property's grandfathered features. But the previous owner told me that pool was installed after 2019. There's no way that's grandfathered." That one comment lit a fire in my brain. If Karen's pool wasn't properly permitted, and she'd been using HOA funds or influence to avoid consequences, then suddenly this wasn't just pettiness. It was corruption. Fueled by caffeine and spite, I spent the rest of the afternoon at the county records office. The clerk was friendly and more than a little curious when I explained what I was looking for. It didn't take long to find what I needed. Karen's property had no record of a pool permit filed after 2018. Not only that, but the construction logs showed a stop-work order had been issued in 2020 for an unpermitted structure exceeding setback limits. That structure? Almost certainly the pool. Somehow, that order was never enforced. I left with photocopies and a feeling of electric revenge surging through my veins. But before I went public, I wanted one more piece of evidence. I needed to know who built her pool and whether they had a pattern of shady work. With a few phone calls and a fake inquiry about getting a pool installed, I found the name of the contractor Karen had used. The guy answered the phone with a half-chewed toothpick in his mouth and a voice that belonged on an episode of Cop. When I mentioned her name, he groaned audibly and said, "She's still bothering people. Look, I'm not touching that job again. You couldn't pay me to go near that backyard." Interesting. I asked if the permit had been an issue, and he got cagey. I don't know what she told the HOA, but we never pulled final clearance. She said she'd handle it politically. I didn't ask. He hung up shortly after. I now had confirmation that Karen's precious pool was an unpermitted time bomb sitting smack dab on her property line. And if that wasn't enough, a deeper dive into HOA records, publicly accessible thanks to a 2015 transparency vote, revealed some truly questionable expenditures. Landscaping charges that looked suspiciously like private garden upgrade. Community improvement charges that matched up to purchases of patio heaters and deck furniture that, curiously, only ever appeared in Karen's backyard. At this point, I was holding a royal flush. All I had to do was lay down the cards. But I wanted to make sure I timed it perfectly. So I contacted the local building inspector's office and filed an anonymous complaint, complete with photos and permit record. Then, for good measure, I reached out to a local reporter known for covering neighborhood scandals. She was all too eager to listen, especially when I dropped the words unpermitted pool, HOA funds, and 911 misuse. She promised to look into it, which I knew was reporter speak for, "I'll have this on the news faster than you can say chlorine." And while all this was brewing behind the scenes, I made a quiet decision. I set up a bird-watching perch in my backyard. Not for actual birds, though a blue jay did stop by once, but angled just enough to see over the privacy fence and into Karen's infamous pool area. If she wanted to play watchdog, I could match her move for move. Only this time, the law and logic were on my side. What she didn't know was that her entire house of cards was about to collapse. And I was going to be the one to blow it down, floaties and all. You said. It didn't take long for the city inspector to act on the anonymous tip I'd submitted. Maybe it was the documentation I provided, or maybe someone on the inside already had their doubts about Karen and was waiting for a reason to look deeper. Either way, just 3 days later, 2 unmarked cars rolled up to Karen's place in the middle of the afternoon. One held a stern-looking building inspector, the other carried a code enforcement officer and, to my barely restrained glee, a uniformed police officer. I wasn't watching through binoculars or anything. I was merely pruning my hedge in full view of her backyard when I saw them knock on her door. Karen opened it, looking like she'd just finished vacuuming the ceiling. Her hair was perfectly sprayed into submission, and she wore that same smug expression she always had when addressing someone she believed was beneath her. But that expression cracked a little when the officer showed her a document. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw her try to block the entry with her body. A minute later, the inspector stepped past her, waving what was clearly a warrant for inspection. Karen stood there, frozen, and then followed them inside. The show had officially started. 20 minutes later, they walked around to the backyard, and that's when I saw them stop cold. The inspector raised his clipboard. He pointed to the far edge of her pool, where the fence curved awkwardly around a small paved patio, exactly where the permit violation had flagged the setback breach. Karen was clearly agitated. Her hands were moving fast, gesturing toward the neighbor's yard like it was their fault for existing. I could practically hear her spinning some kind of nonsense story about property lines and previous owners, but the officer was not buying it. He pulled out a measuring wheel, and as soon as they got the distance confirmed, they started taking pictures. Lots of pictures. The next day, I received a text from the local reporter I'd contacted. Her message was short but sweet. Got confirmation. Not just unpermitted, violation of Greenbelt boundary. Story drops tonight. I stared at my phone for a second before laughing so hard I had to sit down. The Greenbelt was city property. Karen hadn't just built a pool without proper permits, she'd literally stolen public land to extend her backyard. And considering she was the president of the HOA when the violation occurred, this wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially criminal. The article that evening was everything I hoped for. It featured a flattering photo of my own pool, labeled Fully Permitted for Good Measure, alongside a heavily pixelated shot of Karen's backyard and a big, bold headline, HOA President under investigation for alleged misuse of public land. The article described the violation in detail and hinted at financial discrepancies in the HOA budget. It even quoted a community whistleblower who claimed funds were misappropriated. That quote? Also me. The best part was watching the online comments section explode. People from all over town chimed in with stories of HOA horror, and the residents of Serene Meadows quickly turned the tide. For once, Karen was not the voice of authority. She was the subject of ridicule. But the situation still had layers to peel back. After the article, I started hearing from more neighbors, quiet ones who never dared speak out before. One of them, a soft-spoken woman named Denise, stopped by while walking her dog. She handed me a folder and whispered, "Karen made me sign this last year. Said it was to authorize landscaping funds for the whole block. But nothing ever happened." Inside the folder was a copy of a check, made out to a private contractor, endorsed by Karen and labeled Community Enhancement. The amount? Just under $9,000. I recognized the contractor's name. It was the same one who'd installed Karen's illegal pool. This was it. The final puzzle piece. Karen had rerouted HOA funds through fake community projects and used them to finance her backyard paradise, all while punishing residents for things like cracked pavers and slightly mismatched shutters. I compiled everything into a digital dossier. Scanned copies of permits, financial records, emails, and screenshots of the HOA budget report. I sent it to the city attorney's office, copying the local news desk for good measure. It wasn't just a story now, it was a case. Days later, the fallout began. Karen sent out a tone-deaf mass email claiming the media was slandering a devoted community leader, and that the investigation was politically motivated. No one bought it. People started replying all to the email thread with questions like, "Where did the $1,500 for gazebo maintenance go? And why is the HOA still paying for a security patrol that doesn't exist?" The email thread became a digital mutiny. I didn't even need to say a word. The residents were rising up on their own. Then, as if fate wanted to really lean into the drama, another twist emerged. A different neighbor, Ron, the type who always wore socks with sandals and kept to himself, revealed that he'd been recording HOA meetings for years. Apparently, Karen had a habit of saying the quiet part out loud. He uploaded several audio clips to the group chat. One had Karen admitting, "If we increase fines, people will stop pushing back. Just make it sound official." Another had her telling Jeff, the vice president, "Don't worry about permits. We'll bury it in the landscape budget." The reaction was immediate. An emergency vote to remove Karen from the HOA board was called. Flyers were printed, signatures collected, and a special community meeting was scheduled. Karen tried to delay it with procedural nonsense, but no one listened anymore. The power she once held was unraveling in real time, and the people she'd intimidated for years were done pretending. As the day of the vote approached, Karen's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She was seen yelling at the mail carrier, accusing the local teens of stealing her recycling bins, and even tried to block the clubhouse with her car to prevent illegal assembly. That last stunt earned her another visit from the police. This time, a formal warning. I watched the whole thing from my porch, sipping iced tea like I was watching a telenovela. And even though everything was going according to plan, I couldn't help but wonder what her final play would be. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She'd made too many enemies, drawn too much attention, and invested too much ego into her paper crown of neighborhood power. If I had learned anything, it was that people like her don't go quietly. They go out swinging, and sometimes they go out spectacularly. I had no idea what was coming next, but I was ready. The truth was out, the neighborhood was united, and Karen was backed into a corner. And when you corner someone like her, you don't just wait for them to fall, you make sure the landing is unforgettable. The clubhouse was packed tighter than a Black Friday electronics aisle. Folding chairs had been pulled from closets, borrowed from garages, and still, people were standing in the back, arms crossed, faces tight with anticipation. The special HOA meeting to vote on Karen's removal had attracted nearly every resident of Serene Meadows, including a few who hadn't shown their faces at community events in years. It had the energy of a courtroom drama mixed with a block party. Everyone knew something big was about to go down, and no one wanted to miss it. Karen, of course, arrived late. She swept into the room wearing an aggressively floral pantsuit and a look of disdain, holding a binder so thick it looked like she'd printed the entire internet. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't have to. She walked straight to the front of the room and sat down at the board table like nothing was wrong, like the very people she'd antagonized for years weren't about to vote her out of power in the most humiliating way possible. Jeff, her vice president and now the last person still speaking to her voluntarily, sat beside her, visibly sweating. The new acting board chair, a level-headed retired judge named Clara, stood and called the meeting to order. Her voice was calm but firm, and the room fell into silence. "We are here today to vote on the immediate removal of Karen Alton from the HOA Board of Directors," she said. "This vote is being conducted due to credible allegations of financial misconduct, abuse of authority, and breach of community trust." Karen stood up then, clutching her binder like it was a life vest. "These accusations are politically motivated," she began, her voice tight and trembling. "They're being pushed by individuals with personal grudges and an agenda to destabilize the community. Everything I've done has been in the best interest of Serene Meadows. There were audible scoffs, one actual laugh, and a couple of "yeah, right" whispered loudly enough to be intentional. She pressed on, flipping through her binder to display spreadsheets and invoices. I can account for every expense, every decision. These rumors have been blown out of proportion by internet gossip and a smear campaign. Ron, the sock and sandal hero with the audio recordings, raised his hand from the second row. Clara nodded. With all due respect, he said, the recordings don't lie. We've all heard them. You said you could fine us into silence. You used HOA funds for personal projects. And you called the cops on a legally built pool, twice, while using drones to spy on a neighbor. This isn't a smear campaign. This is your legacy. The silence after that was louder than any argument. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Even Jeff leaned away from her like she had developed a contagious disease mid-meeting. Clara called for the vote. It was swift, brutal, and nearly unanimous. Only Karen and Jeff voted against the motion. Applause erupted. A few people stood and clapped. Karen's face went rigid, the kind of blank stare you only see on people who've lost everything in a single breath. She packed up her binder slowly, then turned and walked out without a word, flanked by glares and shaking heads. But her story wasn't over. That night, the local news aired a follow-up segment. Not only had the city confirmed the illegal expansion into Greenbelt land, but they were also preparing to file civil charges for encroachment and fines for violating environmental protection ordinances. Even worse, an anonymous source had leaked copies of HOA expense reports to the news station, highlighting discrepancies too large to ignore. Karen's pool wasn't just unpermitted. It had been built using community funds disguised as landscaping upgrade. The fallout was fast and merciless. Residents demanded full audit. City officials scheduled a formal investigation into the HOA's finances. And Karen, once the unshakable force of Serene Meadows, became a pariah overnight. She no longer answered her door. Her social media went dark. Rumor had it she'd hired a lawyer, but no one had seen her since the meeting. Then, in what can only be described as poetic justice, her prized backyard oasis was officially red-tagged. City workers arrived one morning with orange fencing and posted a massive sign on her back gate. Stop work order, unauthorized construction, do not enter. Her pool was deemed unsafe, her deck partially removed, and the patio dismantled. It was the HOA equivalent of a scarlet letter, except everyone took selfies with it. One resident even printed t-shirts that read, "Fully permitted and proud." But the most satisfying moment came a week later, when a uniformed officer knocked on her door once again. This time, there were no arguments, no screaming. Karen stepped out quietly, purse in hand, as the officer read her the charges: misuse of HOA funds, filing false reports, illegal surveillance, and obstruction. She wasn't cuffed, but the sight of her being led down the driveway to a waiting squad car in broad daylight was enough. Dozens of neighbors watched from driveways and porches, barely hiding their smiles. Someone across the street popped open a can of sparkling water and toasted the air. Her house went on the market within days. The listing was sterile and strangely vague. Spacious backyard with water feature in need of repair. I almost felt bad, almost. But then I remembered the countless notices she'd sent over nonsense violations, the screaming matches over LED lights, the time she'd called the fire department because my grill looked too smoky. No, Karen deserved every bit of this. With her gone, the neighborhood transformed. The new board immediately rolled back the absurd bylaw proposals. People painted their doors weird colors just because they could. One guy put up garden gnomes in every inch of his yard and named them after former board members. The whole neighborhood had a sense of relief, like we'd collectively passed a kidney stone the size of a watermelon. To celebrate, I decided to throw a pool party. Not just any party, a full-blown, no-holds-barred, inflatable unicorn kind of party. I invited everyone, even people I barely knew. The food was potluck style, the drinks were flowing, and the soundtrack alternated between classic rock and ironic HOA-themed parodies someone had written on a ukulele. My float said, "Public Enemy Number 1" on it. Janet brought one that read, "Permitted and Petty." We laughed until we cried, not just because Karen was gone, but because we'd survived her. That night, floating in the calm, chlorinated glow of my definitely legal pool, I thought about everything that had happened. What started as a small annoyance, a petty feud over property lines and control, had revealed something bigger, a community manipulated and bullied by one person with too much power and too little accountability. And when we stood up, when we pushed back with facts, patience, and just the right amount of flair, we won. Not with shouting or vengeance, but with exposure, unity, and a glorious splash of poetic justice. The day Karen finally moved out felt like the 4th of July, Christmas, and the Super Bowl rolled into one. Her massive moving truck blocked the street for hours, and no one complained. In fact, a few people pulled up lawn chairs to watch the spectacle like it was live theater. Every time a lamp or oddly ornate end table got wheeled out, someone would whisper, "Wonder if the HOA paid for that too." By the time the crew started hauling boxes labeled "Office" and "Archives," half the neighborhood was out there pretending to water lawns or take very long walks with dogs who didn't want to be walked. Karen, of course, didn't acknowledge a single soul. She wore dark sunglasses and a visor like she was trying to avoid paparazzi, not neighbors who had spent the last 3 years ducking her clipboard. Her departure wasn't quiet. A news van showed up around noon. Turns out the story had gained regional interest, especially after it came out that the city was seeking reimbursement for public land misuse. The reporter, same one I'd tipped off originally, asked if anyone wanted to comment. No one said much on camera, but off the record? Oh, the stories flowed. About threats over lawn gnome sizes, fines for Halloween decorations being too spooky, even one woman who got a warning for humming too loudly while gardening. Karen's reign of HOA terror had been long and ridiculous, and now it was officially over. With her gone, the new board, led by Clara, got to work fixing the chaos. First order of business: wiping the slate clean. Every bogus fine Karen had issued in the last 18 months was reversed. Refunds were issued. Official apologies were mailed out. People who'd been scared to question the board were now volunteering to help. One neighbor started a committee just to plant wildflowers along the walking path that Karen once called visual clutter. Another offered to repaint the community benches that had been left peeling for years. There was actual progress. People weren't just relieved, they were excited to live here again. As for me, well, my pool was thriving. No more drone flyovers, no more fake citations, no more passive-aggressive notes left in waterproof envelopes taped to my door. I added a new lounge area with an umbrella that could survive a Category 4 hurricane and installed a built-in sound system that streams smooth jazz or petty pop hits depending on my mood. Every evening, as the LED lights danced across the water and the waterfall feature trickled like a spa commercial, I soaked in the sweet satisfaction of a battle well fought and definitively won. But perhaps the most unexpected twist came when a letter arrived from City Hall. At first, I assumed it was more paperwork related to Karen's violations. Instead, it was an invitation to a small ceremony. Apparently, someone had nominated me for a Community Harmony Award, a local honor given to residents who foster positive change in their neighborhoods. I nearly choked on my coffee laughing. Me? The woman who had been public enemy number 1 in Karen's HOA? The same person who had once been accused of hosting an unauthorized aquatic event? But it was real. They wanted to give me a plaque. I showed up in a modest outfit, not wanting to make a scene. But my neighbors? They showed up in force. Janet made buttons that said, "I back the pool." Luis brought cupcakes shaped like floaties. Someone even printed out Karen's original violation letter and turned it into a laminated coaster. I accepted the award with a short speech, mostly thanking everyone for their support, and maybe tossing in one or two jokes about the importance of proper permits and not using drones to settle personal vendettas. The next weekend, we held what could only be described as the party to end all parties. The Karen-free pool bash was legendary. We had music, food trucks, even a magician someone's cousin hired last minute. Kids splashed, adults danced, and the new HOA board handed out mini rubber duckies stamped with, "No drama, just diving." There was a photo booth with props like fake fines, pool noodles, and giant sunglasses. One float was shaped like a gavel. Another said, "Chlorine Queen," and I floated on it for a full hour while sipping a drink with an umbrella the size of a satellite dish. At one point during the party, Clara pulled me aside. She told me how close she'd come to quitting the HOA board under Karen's regime. How she'd almost sold her home just to get away from the nonsense. "But you stood up," she said. "You made the first splash." I told her it wasn't bravery, just stubbornness mixed with a little bit of flair. But deep down, I knew it mattered. When you stand up to someone like Karen, you give others permission to do the same. Weeks passed, and life in Serene Meadows found its rhythm. No more surprise inspections. No more arguments about how long your curtains could be. People were laughing more, hosting barbecues, trading recipes instead of HOA complaints. The energy had shifted. We weren't just neighbors, we were a community again. And though Karen's name still came up from time to time, it was usually followed by a chuckle or a "remember when she tried to ban wind chimes?" As for her old house, it sold quietly to a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. They introduced themselves with a box of muffins and a handwritten note that read, "We heard about the pool. We brought snacks." They were welcomed with open arms. No one mentioned the saga. It was time to move on, to let the Karen era drift away like a leaf in the hot tub jet. Every now and then, I catch myself looking at the back fence where the drone once hovered. It's peaceful now. Birds land on it. Butterflies pass through. Sometimes I float under the stars and let the silence remind me just how far we've come. Not just me, but all of us. A neighborhood that stood up, got loud, got organized, and reclaimed its peace. All sparked by a pool, a few flashing lights, and a woman who underestimated just how powerful a community could be when it stopped being afraid. And as I float there, drink in hand, music humming gently through the speakers, I can't help but smile. Karen may have called 911 thinking she could take me down. But in the end, all she did was give us a reason to unite, to fight back, and to throw the most unforgettable pool party in HOA history.